The antique shop materialized out of nowhere, wedged between a tourist trap selling plastic voodoo dolls and a closed-down jazz club. Eric Maxwell stood before the weathered storefront, squinting at the hand-painted sign that read, Madame Lenore's Curiosities in faded gold lettering. He'd walked this stretch of the French Quarter hundreds of times, but he'd never noticed this place before. A brass bell chimed as he pushed open the door. The air inside hung thick with incense and history, making his collector's instincts tingle. Display cases lined the walls, filled with artifacts that looked far more authentic than the tourist bait offered by neighboring shops. I was wondering when you'd finally notice us. The voice came from behind a beaded curtain. An elderly woman emerged, her silver hair wrapped in an indigo scarf, dark eyes sharp and knowing. I'm Madame Lenore. You're looking for something specific, aren't you? Eric ran a hand through his disheveled brown hair. Not really, I just collect interesting pieces. Things with stories behind them. Ah. Madame Lenore's lips curved into a knowing smile. Then perhaps it's looking for you. She disappeared behind the counter and returned with a brass vessel about the size of a wine bottle. Its surface was covered in intricate engravings that seemed to shift when Eric wasn't looking directly at them. This piece, she said, has been waiting quite a while. Longer than I've been alive, I expect. Eric lifted the vessel carefully. It felt warm to the touch, like it had been sitting in sunlight, though the shop's windows were covered in years of dust. What's the asking price? $20. He almost dropped the vessel. That can't be right. The metalwork alone. Some treasures choose their owners, Mr. Maxwell. She wrapped the vessel in silk before he could ask how she knew his name. They have their own ways of determining value. Back in his apartment, Eric placed the vessel on his coffee table, surrounded by his other finds, African masks, South American pottery, Asian scrolls. But something about this piece was different. The engravings seemed to pulse in the late afternoon light streaming through his windows. Might as well clean you up, he muttered, reaching for his supplies. As he rubbed the brass with a soft cloth, his thumb caught on one of the engravings. A click, barely audible, followed by a hum that vibrated through his bones. Azure light erupted from the vessel's mouth, accompanied by floating silk scarves that seemed to dance on non-existent wind. Eric stumbled backward, knocking over a stack of archaeology magazines. The light coalesced into a human shape, then solidified into the most striking woman he'd ever seen. She floated several inches off the ground, dark hair flowing as if underwater. Her outfit, if you could call it that, consisted of a shimmering bikini that seemed to be made of starlight. Multiple gold bangles adorned her wrists and ankles, tinkling softly as she stretched like someone waking from a long nap. Oh, thank goodness, and she said, her voice carrying an accent he couldn't place. I was beginning to think I'd never get out of there. Her eyes, the color of honey and gold, fixed on him with unmistakable interest. You must be my new master, though I have to say, you're much more attractive than the last one. Eric's throat had gone dry. I'm Eric Maxwell, and you're a djinn? She descended until her bare feet touched his hardwood floor. Syra. She walked around his apartment, examining his collection. Interesting pieces, though that mask is definitely a reproduction. She tapped a wooden African mask, the real ones in a museum in Berlin. How do you, Eric started. I get around. Syra picked up a crystal sphere from his shelf, rolling it between her palms. It began to glow with an inner light. Or I used to, anyway. Being stuck in a vessel for a few decades really limits the social calendar. Eric watched as she made the crystal float between her hands. So, the 3 wishes thing, that's real? She sent the crystal spinning in elaborate patterns. Though I should warn you, I have my own interpretation of wishes. Makes things more interesting. The crystal danced through the air, leaving trails of light, before settling back on its stand. Want to try one out? He thought about Madame Lenore's words. Some treasures choose their owners. I wish to know the history of your vessel, where it came from, how it ended up here. Syra's eyes lit up, literally golden light dancing in their depths. Oh, interesting choice. Most people go straight for money or power. She glided closer, close enough that he could smell something like cinnamon in starlight. Let me show you. She raised her hands and the apartment dissolved around them. They stood in a swirling void of colors and light. Sarah moved behind Eric, her hands on his shoulders. "Don't worry," she whispered, her breath warm against his ear. "This is perfectly safe. Mostly." Images began to form around them. Ancient Persian palaces, Ottoman courts, European sailing ships. "My vessel was created by a master craftsman in Baghdad," Sarah narrated, still standing close enough that Eric felt every word. "He thought he was making a simple container for precious oils, but he accidentally incorporated sacred geometries into the design." The scene shifted faster. A merchant caravan crossing the desert, a storm at sea, a New Orleans marketplace in the 1920s. Through it all, the brass vessel appeared again and again, passing from hand to hand. "And then," Sarah continued, her voice softer, "it waited. For decades. Until you walked by that shop today." The images faded, leaving them standing in Eric's apartment once more. But Sarah didn't step away immediately. "You know what's interesting about your wish? You didn't ask about me. Just the vessel." Eric turned to face her, suddenly aware of how close they were standing. "I figured you'd tell me about yourself when you were ready." Her smile was both playful and dangerous. "Careful, Eric Maxwell. Keep being thoughtful like that, and you might find your next two wishes getting very interesting indeed." She floated backward, settling onto his couch with supernatural grace. "So, what else do you want to know? We have time before your next wish. And I have to say," she stretched, the movement making her ethereal outfit shimmer, "I'm quite curious about you too." Eric sat in his reading chair, trying to maintain some semblance of composure. "Where do we even start?" "Wherever you like." Sarah created a small whirlwind of sparkles in her palm. "Though I should mention, the more interesting the conversation, the more impressive the magic." She winked. "Just a little incentive for honesty." And as the afternoon sun painted his apartment in gold, Eric found himself engaged in the strangest and most intriguing conversation of his life, with a djinn who seemed determined to blur the lines between magic and flirtation. "So you're telling me you once helped build the pyramids?" Eric leaned forward in his chair, forgetting his earlier nervousness in his fascination with her stories. "Helped is a strong word." Sarah lazily traced patterns in the air, leaving trails of golden light that formed miniature pyramids floating above the coffee table. "I more supervised. Previous master's wish. He wanted to go down in history. Should have been more specific about how." She smirked. "He ended up as a rather uninspiring middle manager on the project." "That's a bit cruel, isn't it? I prefer creatively interpretive." The miniature pyramids transformed into a swirling galaxy of stars. "Besides, he was terribly rude. Kept calling me woman in that condescending tone." Her eyes flashed. "I may be bound to grant wishes, but I'm not anyone's servant." Eric watched the stellar display above his coffee table. "And what am I? Your master?" "Technically," Sarah dissolved the star field with a wave. "But you're already more interesting than most. Usually by now I'd be dealing with wishes for mountains of gold or harems of beautiful women." She raised an eyebrow. "Unless that's coming up on your wish list?" "No, Eric felt his face grow warm. "That's not really my style." "Good answer." Sarah floated up from the couch, drifting toward his collection of artifacts. "Though I have to wonder, what is your style, Eric Maxwell?" She paused before a pre-Columbian figurine. "Most people don't fill their homes with pieces of the past unless they're looking for something. Maybe I just appreciate history." "Maybe." She turned to face him, and for a moment her playful facade dropped. "Or maybe you're like me, trapped between worlds, never quite fitting in anywhere." The observation hit uncomfortably close to home. Eric stood, walking to his window that overlooked the French Quarter. "Is that what it's like? Being a djinn?" Sarah appeared beside him, her reflection in the glass both there and not there, like smoke caught in sunlight. "It's complicated. We exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, hence the floating." She demonstrated by doing a lazy backward somersault in midair. "Physical laws are more like suggestions. But it can be lonely, seeing the world change while you remain the same." "How old are you?" Eric asked, then immediately regretted it. "Sorry, that's probably rude." Old enough to have seen empires rise and fall. She landed beside him, her shoulder almost touching his. Young enough to still find humans fascinating. Her eyes met his in the reflection, especially ones who ask about vessel histories instead of wishing for power. Eric turned to face her, suddenly aware of how the setting sun painted her skin in shades of gold and amber. What would you wish for? If you could. The question seemed to catch her off guard. The playful mask slipped again, revealing something vulnerable underneath. But before she could answer, a tremor ran through the apartment. The artifacts on their shelves began to rattle. Ah, Sarah's expression turned apologetic. That would be the dimensional bleed. The what? Side effect of prolonged manifestation without a wish being actively granted. She gestured at the vibrating objects. My presence tends to destabilize reality a bit. Nothing serious, just the fabric of space-time getting a little wrinkled. A ceramic bowl started to float off its shelf. Eric lunged to catch it. You might want to make your second wish soon, Sarah suggested, helping him restore order to his rattling collection. Or I'll have to return to the vessel temporarily to let things stabilize. Eric set the bowl back in its place. I don't want to waste it. The wishes, I mean. Trust me, Sarah's smile returned. But there was something different about it now. Less teasing, more genuine. Based on what I've seen so far, I don't think you could waste them if you tried. Another tremor shook the apartment. A crack appeared in the ceiling, leaking what looked like starlight. Though you might want to decide relatively quickly, Sarah floated up to inspect the crack. Unless you want to explain to your landlord why your apartment is suddenly a portal to the 11th dimension? Eric watched as she pressed her hand against the crack, sealing it with a touch that left traces of gold light behind. The way she moved, the casual display of impossible power, should have terrified him. Instead, he found himself more intrigued than ever. All right, he said, I have an idea for my second wish. But first, what happens to you? Between wishes, I mean? Sarah descended, landing so close he could see flecks of actual gold in her eyes. Worried about me already, Eric Maxwell? Her voice was teasing, but he caught the note of surprise beneath it. Careful, a girl might get the wrong idea. Or the right one. The apartment trembled again, but neither of them moved. For a moment they stood in perfect stillness, the air between them charged with something that felt both magical and dangerously human. Then Sarah took a step back, though her eyes never left his. Make your wish, she said softly. Make it count. Eric took a deep breath, knowing his next words would either be brilliantly insightful or catastrophically stupid. Possibly both. I wish to understand your world, Eric said. Not just see it, but to experience it the way you do. The trembling in the apartment stopped abruptly. Sarah's eyes widened, the gold in them blazing like captured sunlight. That's unusually specific. She moved closer, her feet leaving the ground. And potentially dangerous. Are you sure? Yes, Eric held her gaze. Show me what it means to exist between dimensions. A smile curved Sarah's lips. Well, if you insist. She extended her hand, fingers trailing sparks of azure light. But fair warning, this might be more intimate than you're expecting. When Eric took her hand, reality shifted. The apartment dissolved around them, replaced by a vast expanse of swirling colors and geometric patterns that shouldn't have been possible in three-dimensional space. They floated in a void that felt both infinite and impossibly close. Welcome to the in-between, Sarah said, still holding his hand. Her form seemed more fluid here, edges blending with the surrounding magic. This is where I exist when I'm not bound to the physical world. Eric felt weightless, his consciousness expanding to perceive impossible angles and colors that had no names in human language. But more than that, he felt Sarah's presence, not just physically, but on a fundamental level, as if their very atoms were harmonizing. This is incredible. He turned slowly, watching patterns of reality fold and unfold around them. It's like seeing the universe's source code. That's one way to put it. Sarah drew closer, her free hand tracing patterns in the void that became doorways to other realms. Want to see more? Through the first portal, they emerged onto a crystalline plain under 3 moons. Through another, they found themselves in a city built from living light. Each realm brought them physically closer, the magic of Eric's wish creating a connection that transcended normal boundaries. In a garden where flowers bloomed with memories instead of petals, Syra finally spoke about her past. We Jinn were created to be bridges between worlds, she said, picking a flower that showed her first granting of a wish centuries ago. But bridges aren't supposed to feel. We're meant to be conduits, nothing more. Eric watched the memory play out in the flower's petals. But you do feel more than I should. She released the flower, letting it dissolve into sparkles, especially around you. They moved through more realms, a library where books wrote themselves, a desert where the sand was made of time itself. In each place, the boundary between them grew thinner, their energies intertwining in ways that defied physical laws. There's something you should know, Sarah said as they floated through a constellation garden. Her usual playfulness had given way to vulnerability. This connection we're forming, it's forbidden. Jinn aren't supposed to form emotional attachments to their masters. I'm not your master, Eric said. He reached out, his fingers brushing her cheek. Where they touched, reality rippled. And I don't want to be. The magic around them pulsed in response to their proximity. Syra's form flickered between human and something far more ethereal. Eric. Her voice carried harmonics that made the air shimmer. This is dangerous. I don't care. Their first kiss bent reality, literally. The constellation garden twisted around them, stars rearranging themselves into new patterns. Syra's magic surged, wrapping them in a cocoon of light and possibility. When they finally pulled apart, Eric noticed something had changed. The magic wasn't just around them anymore. It was within him too. Golden light coursed through his veins, and he could see the multiple dimensions Sarah existed in simultaneously. That wasn't supposed to happen, Sarah whispered, but she didn't sound upset. If anything, she seemed thrilled by the development. You're carrying some of my essence now. Is that bad? It's unprecedented. She created a mirror of pure energy, showing him his reflection. His eyes now held traces of the same gold as hers, and potentially catastrophic. They returned to his apartment, but things had changed. Reality bent subtly around them. Books floated off shelves when they kissed. Time slowed during their conversations, and flowers sprouted from the floorboards when they touched. Days began to blur together. Eric called in sick to work, unable to explain that linear time had become more of a suggestion than a rule in his apartment. They explored both magical and mundane pleasures, sharing coffee that tasted of stardust, watching movies while floating near the ceiling, having conversations that lasted both minutes and centuries. But the magic was becoming unstable. The more they connected, the more reality warped around them. Plants in the neighborhood began blooming out of season. Clocks ran backwards. Gravity became optional within a 3-block radius. One evening, as they lay tangled together on a couch that was simultaneously in Eric's apartment and somewhere in the 11th dimension, Sarah finally voiced her fears. This can't last, she said, tracing patterns on his chest that left actual light trails. The overlap between our worlds is growing too strong. Reality itself is starting to unravel. Eric watched a tear in space-time open above them, leaking stardust onto his coffee table. There has to be a way. There is. Sarah sat up, her form flickering between dimensions. Your final wish. You could wish for things to return to normal, for reality to stabilize. And lose you, she smiled sadly. Or lose the world as you know it. The universe doesn't like paradoxes, Eric. A djinn and a human existing in quantum superposition. We're breaking fundamental laws of existence. As if to emphasize her point, the walls of the apartment became transparent, revealing the swirling chaos of the in-between trying to merge with physical reality. In the street below, pedestrians walked backwards, their conversations playing in reverse. How long do we have? Eric asked, pulling her closer, as reality continued to fracture around them. Until your final wish. Sarah's voice echoed across multiple dimensions. After that, everything changes, one way or another. The apartment trembled, but this time it wasn't just dimensional bleed. It was the fabric of the universe protesting their impossible connection. Books began writing themselves, filling their pages with stories of other worlds. The television showed programs from parallel dimensions. Even gravity seemed uncertain, alternating between Earth normal and something else entirely. "I won't lose you," Eric said, even as he felt reality trying to pull them apart. "There has to be another way." Sarah's response was cut off by a massive reality quake that sent cracks running through the air itself. Through the fissures, they could see other worlds, other possibilities, all trying to collapse into their space. They held each other as the universe continued to fragment around them, neither willing to speak the truth they both knew. The final wish was coming, and with it, a decision that would change everything. The question wasn't just what Eric would wish for, it was whether any wish could resolve the paradox they'd become. Reality continued to fracture around them as Eric held Sarah close, watching the walls of his apartment phase between dimensions. Through one crack, he saw a desert of crystal sand. Through another, a city where gravity flowed sideways. The boundaries between worlds were dissolving. "Eric," Sarah's voice echoed with harmonics from multiple dimensions. "We can't keep delaying. The universe—" A reality quake interrupted her, stronger than before. The floor beneath them rippled like water, and for a moment they could see straight through to the core of the earth, glowing with both magma and magic. "I know," Eric said, his own voice carrying traces of the power they'd shared. The gold in his eyes flared as another dimension tried to bleed through. "But I can't just let you go. Not now." Sarah created a bubble of stable space around them, but even her considerable power was straining against the chaos. "You have to make the final wish. If you don't, every reality will collapse into this point. The universe is trying to correct a paradox that was never meant to exist." "Us," Eric said softly. "Us." She touched his face, her fingers leaving trails of starlight on his skin. "A djinn and a human, sharing essence. Sharing—" She hesitated, then finished. "Sharing love." The word caused another reality spike. Outside their bubble, time began running in multiple directions simultaneously. Eric watched as memories of their time together played out in reverse, forward, and sideways through time. Their first kiss in the Constellation Garden, shared moments of both magic and mundane joy, nights spent talking about everything and nothing while floating near the ceiling. "There has to be a way," he said, his mind racing. "The rules of wish-making are absolute." Sarah's form flickered between human and pure energy. "After the third wish, I must return to the vessel. It's cosmic law." Eric watched as another memory played out in a reality tear. Sarah laughing as she made his coffee taste like stardust, her joy at experiencing simple human pleasures. An idea began to form. "The law says you have to return to the vessel," he said slowly. "But it doesn't say you have to stay there, does it?" Sarah's eyes widened. "Eric, what if—" He stood, pulling her up with him. Around them, reality continued to fracture, but he barely noticed. What if the wish itself could change the rules? Before she could respond, he took both her hands in his. "Sarah, I wish for you to be free, truly free to choose your own path, whether that's with me or in your world or anywhere else in all these dimensions we've seen. I wish for you to have the power to decide your own fate." The chaos around them froze. Every reality tear, every dimensional bleed, every temporal distortion stopped mid-formation. Sarah stared at him, her form glowing brighter and brighter until she was almost painful to look at. "You dot, dot, dot." Her voice contained multitudes. "You just gave up your last wish. For me." "Not gave up," Eric said. "I used it exactly how I wanted to." Light exploded outward from Saira's form, filling the apartment, the building, the entire French Quarter. When it faded, all the reality fractures had sealed themselves. The walls were solid again, the floor stable, time flowing in one direction. And Saira was still there, but different. She stood on the floor, actually stood, not floated, wearing a simple sundress instead of her ethereal bikini. But her eyes still held that otherworldly gold, and when she moved, starlight rippled in her wake. "The wish," she said, wonder in her voice. "It created a new precedent. No human has ever wished for a jinn's freedom to choose. The paradox ... She laughed, the sound making flowers bloom on his windowsill. The paradox resolved itself because you didn't try to force an outcome. You gave me choice. Eric took a step toward her. And what do you choose? In answer, Sarah closed the distance between them. The kiss tasted of possibility and promise. And while it didn't bend reality like before, the stars visible through his window definitely rearranged themselves into heart patterns. I choose this, she said when they finally parted. I choose to learn how to be both, jinn and human, magical and mortal. I choose, she smiled. I choose you, Eric Maxwell. Eric dropped to one knee, taking her hand. The gold in his eyes matched hers as he asked, Then choose forever with me? Sarah's delighted laugh made all the street lights in the French Quarter flare like miniature suns. Yes, she said, pulling him up into another kiss. Though I should warn you, our wedding is going to be literally out of this world. Later that night, they walked through the French Quarter, Sarah's magic now contained but still spectacular. Stars danced overhead, forming constellations that told their story. She'd kept her powers but learned to temper them, to exist in the human world without breaking it. They passed Madame Lenore's shop, but the space between buildings was empty now, as if it had never existed. Yet in the window of another store, their reflection showed not just them, but infinite versions of themselves across countless dimensions, all finding each other, all choosing each other. So, Eric said, watching as Saira made the moonlight paint patterns on the cobblestones, about those mystical friends of yours who might need human guides. Saira's smile held both mischief and magic. Well, there is this phoenix I know who's always been curious about human music, and I hear New Orleans has quite the jazz scene. They walked on through the enchanted night, their path lit by stars that hadn't existed until Saira wished them into being. Their story had ended and begun simultaneously, a paradox resolved by love, a new reality shaped by choice, and a future that promised to be extraordinary in both magical and perfectly ordinary ways. Above them, the cosmos adjusted its laws ever so slightly, making room for this new kind of existence, where jinn could choose to be human, humans could carry traces of magic, and love could quite literally transcend dimensions. The brass vessel sat on Eric's mantelpiece, no longer a prison, but a reminder of how they'd found each other. And if sometimes their kisses still made reality hiccup just a little, well, even the universe had to admit that some rules were made to be bent. After all, as a certain shopkeeper had once said, some treasures choose their owners, and sometimes, if you're very lucky, they choose to stay. 1 month after Eric's final wish, Sarah stood before the mirror of realities in their apartment, a side effect of their unique bond that had turned their living room mirror into a portal between worlds. Her reflection showed not just her human form, but echoes of her jinn essence, still powerful and somehow enhanced by her choice to embrace mortality. Ready? Eric asked, intertwining his fingers with hers. Gold light sparked where their skin touched, a reminder that their connection had fundamentally altered both of their natures. They're not going to be happy about this, Sarah said, watching ripples of possibility dance across the mirror's surface. The Jinn Council has rules older than most civilizations, rules you've already broken. Eric pulled her closer, making the air around them shimmer with fractals of magic. Successfully, I might add. True. Sarah pressed her free hand against the mirror's surface, causing it to ripple like liquid starlight. But visiting the ethereal realm as a rogue djinn with my human consort, that's a whole new level of scandal. The mirror's surface parted like a curtain, revealing a vast crystal city floating in an impossibly beautiful void. Spires of living light reached toward multiple suns, while bridges of pure energy connected floating islands that defied physics. Welcome to Madinat al-Jinn, Sarah said, leading Eric through the portal. Try not to look directly at anything for too long. Human minds aren't meant to process 11-dimensional architecture. They emerged onto a platform of opalescent crystal. Other jinn floated past, some in traditional forms of pure energy, others choosing more corporeal appearances. All of them stopped to stare at the impossible pair. A former jinn, still crackling with power, hand in hand with a human whose eyes held traces of magical gold. Syra bint al-Noor. A voice like thunder and wind chimes echoed across the platform. A figure composed of pure light and geometric patterns descended toward them. You dare return after breaking our most sacred laws? Hello, Father. Syra's grip on Eric's hand tightened. I dare quite a lot these days. The light being flickered, its patterns reorganizing into something almost human, an elegant man with silver hair and eyes like supernovas. You choose to remain in that limited form, even here? I choose to be who I am, Syra replied, which is more than most of us can say. Other jinn had gathered now, forming a floating audience around them. Eric noticed some watching Syra with undisguised longing, particularly the younger ones, whose forms seemed less rigidly geometric than their elders. You have corrupted our ways, another voice accused. A jinn made of dark energy and constellation patterns emerged from the crowd. First by loving a human, then by abandoning your vessel, and now by returning to flaunt your defiance. I didn't come to flaunt anything, Counselor Kadim. Syra's voice carried harmonics that made the crystal beneath them sing. I came to show there's another way. Look around you. How many of us are tired of being bound by rules created before humanity learned to make fire? Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Several younger jinn drifted closer, their forms flickering between traditional patterns and more human appearances. It's true, one of them spoke up, a female voice from a form of swirling stardust. I've watched humanity for centuries. They feel so much, learn so much. Why must we remain static? Because it is our nature, Sarah's father boomed. We are beings of power and purpose, not flesh and emotion. Really? Syra released Eric's hand and floated upward, her form shifting between human and pure energy. Then explain this. She raised her hands and reality bent around her. But instead of the chaos that usually accompanied such displays, her magic formed perfect, controlled patterns, more stable than any traditional jinn magic they'd seen. Impossible, Counselor Kadim whispered. Your power should have diminished when you chose mortality. It evolved, Eric spoke up, causing several jinn to recoil at a human addressing them directly. Just like she did. Just like all of you could. You dare, Kadim began, but Sarah's father raised a hand for silence. Show me, he said, studying his daughter with eyes that saw through multiple dimensions. Show me this evolution. What followed was a demonstration that redefined what the jinn thought possible. Syra performed feats of magic that combined human creativity with jinn power, creating effects that were both more beautiful and more controlled than traditional magic. Our power doesn't come from our restrictions, she explained, creating a miniature galaxy that danced between her fingers. It comes from who we are, and we can be so much more than what these ancient laws demand. One by one, younger jinn began to shift their forms, experimenting with more human appearances. The air filled with magic as they tested new ways of expressing their power. The old laws served their purpose, Sarah continued, returning to Eric's side. But the universe has changed. Humanity has changed. Maybe it's time we did too. Her father floated closer, his form shifting through multiple patterns as he considered her words. Finally, he assumed an almost human appearance, still made of light, but with recognizable features that echoed Sayira's own. Perhaps, he said slowly, it is time for the Jinn Council to evolve as well. The declaration sent ripples of excitement through the gathered crowd. Several jinn immediately began practicing more human forms, while others engaged in heated discussions about the implications of change. This won't be easy, Sarah whispered to Eric as they watched the chaos unfold. Centuries of tradition don't change overnight. Good thing we have all the time in multiple dimensions, Eric replied, pulling her close enough that their combined magic made the crystal platform beneath them glow. And what about you, she asked. Ready to be the first human ambassador to the Jinn realm? As long as you're with me. He kissed her, causing several nearby jinn to gasp at the display of human affection. Though we might want to work on controlling that reality-warping thing our kisses do. Oh, I don't know. Syra grinned as fractal patterns of light spiraled out from where they stood. I think a little reality warping is exactly what this place needs. Above them, the multiple suns of the ethereal realm seemed to shine brighter, as if the universe itself approved of this new chapter in Jin-human relations. New possibilities stretched out before them, a future where magic and humanity could intertwine, where love could bridge dimensions, and where even the oldest of beings could learn to embrace change. And somewhere in New Orleans, in a shop that appeared only to those who needed to find it, Madame Lenore smiled as she placed another brass vessel on her shelf, waiting for the next person ready to discover that some rules were meant to be broken, some loves were meant to transcend dimensions, and some treasures were meant to choose their own destiny. Dear listener, in concluding The Vessel's Choice, we've explored more than just a love story between a djinn and a human. We've ventured into the heart of what makes us truly alive, the courage to choose our own path, even when that path defies the very laws of existence. Eric and Saira's journey reminds us that the most powerful magic isn't found in wishes or supernatural abilities, but in the transformative power of authentic connection. Their story challenges us to question the boundaries we accept as unchangeable in our own lives. How many of us, like Sarah, live within vessels of our own making, containers of expectations, traditions, and fears that limit who we could become? The tale speaks to anyone who has ever felt caught between worlds, the practical and the passionate, the expected and the desired, the safe and the extraordinary. Like Eric, we all occasionally find ourselves seeking something we can't quite name, collecting pieces of the past while hoping they'll somehow illuminate our future. And like Saira, many of us struggle with the weight of expectations, trying to balance who we are with who others think we should be. But perhaps the most profound message lies in the story's treatment of rules and limitations. The universe, as Saira and Eric discovered, isn't as rigid as we sometimes believe. Even fundamental laws can bend in the presence of something powerful enough, be it love, courage, or the simple determination to write one's own story. Their tale teaches us that true change often requires us to risk everything we know for everything we could become. The most meaningful connections often come when we dare to show our authentic selves. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is choose happiness, even when that choice defies convention. Innovation and tradition don't have to be enemies. They can dance together to create something entirely new. The most powerful transformations often begin with a single choice to be more than what others expect us to be. In the end, this story isn't just about a magical being choosing humanity or a human embracing the extraordinary. It's about the courage it takes to recognize that the most profound magic often lies in our capacity to change, to love, and to choose our own destiny. As you close this story, consider your own brass vessels, the limitations you've accepted, the boundaries you've never questioned. What magic might you find if you dared to look beyond them? What reality might you bend if you chose to believe in possibilities rather than limitations? Remember, like Madame Lenore's shop, opportunities for transformation often appear exactly when we're ready to find them. And sometimes, the most extraordinary adventures begin with simply being brave enough to notice what's always been there, waiting for us to be ready. Perhaps you too have a bit of magic waiting to be discovered. Perhaps you too are ready to choose your own impossible. After all, as our story shows, the universe has a wonderful way of making room for those brave enough to defy its supposed limits. And who knows? Maybe somewhere, in some dimension, Saira and Eric are raising their glasses to you, celebrating your courage to begin your own journey of transformation. Because in the end, aren't we all just stories waiting to break free from our vessels? With faith in magic and belief in possibilities, Sci-Fi Lore Vault PS. Remember what Madame Lenore said? Some treasures choose their owners. Perhaps this story has chosen you for a reason. What will you do with its magic?